Well, good morning, guys. This is Shelton here, and I am actually going to walk you through a little bit about the Chapter 9 reading guide. What we're going to be talking about in this particular session is we're going to be continuing our conversation about Chapter 9 nervous system, point 7, when we addressed neurotransmitters. So we'll carry that on a little bit and all the way through Chapter 9.12, so 9.12 on the spinal cord. So if you guys will get your reading guides out, also you may want to have your textbook because your textbook then is going to give you some of the pictures and diagrams that I'm going over and kind of help you also understand your reading guide too. So I'll give you a minute. You can pause me in order to do that. And then as always, bear with me because unusual times I am not super familiar with online presentations. So, I'm going to make lots of mistakes, but I'm going to do the best I can in explaining it and kind of providing you at least similar to what we do in class and some of the discussions that we do have in class. So with that, let's actually go to the PowerPoint presentation that we have on the nervous system. Here's kind of your fast review of what we've gone over. Actually pay attention here to our myelinated cells. That's going to play an important role. We're going to talk about white matter and gray matter inside the central nervous system today too. And so that goes back to our oligodendrocytes. Remember that your white matter, or when we have myelinated axons, that speeds up that rate of the impulse to about 100 meters per second. It's not how fast it is. When we talk about something like gray matter then is referring to axons then that would not be myelinated, and they still actually send impulses really quickly, but about a meter per second. And we're going to see in the central nervous system today, especially in the spinal cord, that arrangement of white matter versus gray matter is what we'll need to pay attention to. Now, where we left off is we talked about the action potential and addressing the actions of the action potential. And where we left off was actually talking about the actions of the synapse. And remember that at a synapse is two neurons that are communicating. So what you're seeing in this picture up here is the end of an axon that we call the presynaptic neuron, and then we see the beginning of the next dendrite for cell communication. And so with this, what it's showing you is that how two neurons do communicate is via these chemicals called neurotransmitters. Now, what we also went over is we went over the fact that neurotransmitters come in lots of different forms. There's about 50 different neurotransmitters in the human body, and we did a chart that kind of went over some of these different neurotransmitters, where they act, central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. And the one that I need you guys to make sure that you are definitely paying attention to is dopamine, because that dopamine, that's our reward system. And you're going to see that when we talk about illegal drugs, legal and illegal drugs that lead to addiction, there's always an increase in dopamine that tells your brain, that was awesome, do it again. And so this is what gets people addicted to different types of drugs. Now, when we do talk about drug use, and this is part of what you need to address, I highly suggest, in order to understand this, that you go to the activity mouse party. So mouse party is going to walk you through a whole bunch of different drugs. It's going to show you the direct action that each of these drugs actually plays here at the synapse and at different parts of the brain, which has a different result when different neurotransmitters in different regions of the brain are actually affected. What you guys are going to see is that these legal and illegal drugs, what they are often doing, and they can act in lots of different ways. Some of them can actually they can actually mimic the neurotransmitter. So they get into this space, because this is a space here. So anything that is in the blood can actually get into this space. So they can mimic a neurotransmitter, sending a false signal. Sometimes what they can do is block the uptake of neurotransmitters. This diagram isn't showing you these active pumps. And actually some other drugs can actually get in and kind of fake out the cell. They can kind of become almost like a Trojan horse and get into these areas and actually now kind of trick the neuron into releasing too many neurotransmitters, because it was able to get in here and kind of disrupt the normal neurotransmitter activity. So take a look, but bottom line is, when we do talk about these drug interactions, it is always, always, always affecting the synapse. And it's always kind of making sure we understand this action here too. So kind of look at all those different interactions. Again, mouse party. It's actually a really cool, very, very great website. So I've linked that on the Schoology for you too. So don't hesitate to take a look at that one. Now, for 9.9. So at 9.9, if we take a look at this picture, it probably reminds you a lot about the skeletal muscles when we actually took a look at skeletal muscle structure. Because what this is trying to show you is what a nerve is. And remember that a nerve is actually these bundles of axons. And in this particular case, I've got my axon down here. So this is the single cell. And then it's wrapped with, in this picture, that's showing you the Schwann cells. So these little tortilla shells that are myelinated and wrapping around there. And so with that, what you end up seeing is that we end up having these bundles and bundles and bundles of axons. And all of this is connective tissue that is actually supporting, also with blood supply, because remember those action potentials require a ton of energy in order for the sodium potassium pump to reset. That salty banana, that sodium on the outside, potassium on the inside, back to rest. So lots and lots of blood supply, but all of this together of these just bundles upon bundles of these single axons of the neuron are going to be what we call a nerve. So kind of recognize that one as well. Now, when we talk about, and to review here too, if I talk about a sensory nerve, that direction that the sensory nerve sends signals, sensory nerves are all coming from the peripheral, the outside part, towards that central nervous system, towards the brain and spinal cord. And then if we're talking about a motor nerve, motor nerves then are sending signals from the central nervous system out to cause action. So that should be a review of just our basic neurons. Now we're just applying it to a nerve, which is bundles of axons, is what we're addressing there. Now, at 9.10, when we talk about nerve pathways, so this is also a review of our 3 different types of neurons. But when we talk about a reflex arc, and so reflexes are actually these very simple relays of messages in order to initiate just an automatic response, something that is just doesn't take a lot of time. The brain doesn't have to get involved with the decision. Reflexes often are just the sensory neuron sending a signal to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord actually making the response back with an interneuron, sometimes without, we're going to see that, and then back out to the motor neuron here. So in this is a reflex arc. This happens to be an example of the knee-jerk reflex. So with this knee-jerk reflex, this one is a withdrawal reflex. So with this withdrawal reflexes are always involving 3 neurons. And so with 3 neurons, this withdrawal reflex, so this would be similar like if you stepped on a tack, and when you step on a tack, go back, or touched a hot stove or something along those lines, the sensory neuron sends a signal to, and this is my spinal cord over here, it sends it to the spinal cord, and within the spinal cord has an interneuron that realizes, oh shoot, this is really important. In order to save this dumb person who just stepped on a tack or touched a hot stove, we need to act right away. And so the interneuron is actually going to make the decision to now instantly send out this motor neuron and this motor response in order to pull the foot back, pull the hand back, or to respond very, very quickly. So you've usually acted before your brain even recognizes, or you recognize, ooh, ouch, that was hot. Glad I moved fast in order to mitigate or decrease the amount of tissue damage that actually happens. So this is a withdrawal reflex. I ask you down here which neurons are involved, and what you should be able to recognize on a diagram is that this is my sensory neuron, here is my interneuron that's in the spinal cord, and then here's my motor neuron that is now causing action in the muscles to be able to withdraw. Now, the knee-jerk reflex. So once again, we didn't get to do this lab where I give you guys reflex hammers. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. But in this particular reflex, this knee-jerk reflex actually here on this patellar ligament, so here's my patella, actually attached to the tibia. This is a very primitive reflex, and it actually helps us stand for extended periods of time. And so if there's any type of tension that is felt here in this patellar ligament, and so by tapping that, some of you guys don't feel that, but what happens is a sensory neuron is actually going to send a signal to the spinal cord. However, since this is such a primitive and important reflex, there actually isn't even an interneuron that's going to make this ultimate decision. So what happens is, oh, we got to stand, we got to tighten up the quadricep muscle. So the motor neuron then sends a signal right back out to the quadricep to tighten up, don't fall down. And so that's why if you're sitting down, you can actually see that in your foot kicking out in that knee jerk reflex. Now you can try it at home. Instead of using a reflex hammer, you can use this soft spot of your hand and you can try to hit that patellar ligament. So because you're home, try it on a sibling, try it on your parents and see if they have a patellar, this knee-jerk reflex. Just have them sitting on a table with their legs dangling before you do that. Sometimes having them look away kind of helps them relax the quadriceps so you can actually test that particular reflex. So try that one. Do not try the withdrawal reflex. Do not touch a hot stove and see what happens. Shouldn't have to say that, but I am. Now, when we go to 9.11, so the meninges. When we talk about the meninges are these layers of tissue. There's 3 different layers that actually surround the brain and the spinal cord. And you can actually see here these 3 layers of meninges. Here's actually up close here around the brain. And these 3 layers, so here's my scalp, there's the cranium, here's my cerebrum, we're going to talk about that. But the meninges are these 3 layers that actually surround and actually keep the brain and spinal cord encased in their own body cavity. So cerebral spinal fluid stays within that cavity, and then the brain and spinal cord really are protected from the other regions of the body. It also keeps your brain and spinal cord protected in forms of viruses and bacteria, where a lot of viruses and bacteria can't get into that space. However, there are some that can, which we'll talk about meningitis in just a second. Now, the 3 layers of the meninges that you have to know. If you kind of think about what meninges are, their job, I like to say that their job is to pad the brain and spinal cord. Because the 3 layers, we think of pad. The pia mater is the layer that is closest to the brain and spinal cord. That pia mater is actually a really fine, very fine connective tissue. It's kind of glassy and kind of glossy. The arachnoid mater is then the middle layer. That arachnoid mater, it's called the arachnoid mater because it's very fibrous and it looks like spider webs is why that is. And then the outer layer is the dura mater, and the dura mater, super durable, dura mater. But the dura mater then is this really tough outer layer that really encases that brain and spinal cord. So pad from the inside out, or DAP if you want to go outside in. But if you ever you can YouTube some open brain surgeries, and you can see that once they go through the bone, then you can actually see them having to cut through this dura mater, this really tough layer, in order to then be able to expose the brain. So that would be a suggestion, is go to YouTube and look at some open brain surgeries that might be posted for you so you guys can actually see those meninges. Now, if we also look at the meninges, then so here's just that close-up picture. So here you can actually see the meninges that are around then the brain. But then down here around the spinal cord, this is where we can now actually start to see those meninges down here. Now, when we talk about the brain and spinal cord, right here, this is the base of the skull down here. And this base of the skull, and then here is my first cervical vertebrae. Remember that first cervical vertebrae? That was called the atlas, also known as C1. And then I had my axis, which was C2. Well, this hole that is in your skull is called the foramen magnum. So that's a term that you guys are going to need to know too, and I'll show you that in just a second. But that foramen magnum, with this particular hole, there's meninges that actually kind of guide this area down here, and then C1 and C2. Now, when we do talk about meninges and then also meningitis, take a look here on our spinal cord, we can actually see it again. So here's actually just showing spinal cord. Here are the meninges again, my pad, my pia mater, my arachnoid mater, my dura mater. Now, one of the things that you guys should recognize as future college students is a very contagious and very deadly disorder is meningitis. Now, there's 2 different types of meningitis. There's a viral meningitis and a bacterial meningitis. But if you ever find that you are starting to get really sick, and then if it comes on very, very quickly with severe headaches, and then if you try to touch your chin to your chest, so if you ever do that action when you're feeling really headachy and your neck is hurting and you cannot touch your chin to your chest, without severe pain, get yourself to the emergency room right away because meningitis could be deadly. Bacterial meningitis, especially viral meningitis, has long-term effects, but you definitely don't want inflammation of the surrounding connective tissue that is protecting the brain and spinal cord. But meningitis, nothing to take lightly. Get yourself to the ER if you can't touch your chin to your chest and you've got fever, headache, and symptoms along those lines. Now, when we do take a look at the spinal cord, and the spinal cord, so here's your vertebrae. Remember, your vertebrae has this hole, and then we've got the body of the vertebrae up here. But in between every single vertebrae, what we actually have is branching out for the peripheral nervous system is spinal nerves. So between every single vertebrae, you have a pair of spinal nerves that extend out to the rest of the body. So that should be something that you also recognize from this. Now, on this picture, I'm going to use this picture on your test as well, because if we look at the spinal cord, your spinal cord has kind of this butterfly shape in the middle. So this is actually showing you where the white matter versus the gray matter within the spinal cord actually is. Now, when we show the reflex arc, so those interneurons are actually here in the gray matter, only has to send a signal over a very short distance, so it doesn't have to go fast. So we can have lots and lots of neurons condensed in that area. And then our white matter, your white matter is going to be myelinated, and that is for carrying signals very rapidly up and down the spinal cord as well. So make sure that you guys are paying attention to that. And so you're understanding from 9.12, the foramen magnum, you're understanding then the spinal nerves, you're understanding then gray matter versus white matter. So here's a better picture showing you that. This is the one I have on the test. So make sure you're paying attention to that. And then here you can see kind of downward, and you can actually see in here, you can see the spinal cord, and the spinal cord has lots of fluid in here too. So this epidural space. So for some of you who have heard of, your relatives having babies and they get an epidural or they have severe pain, and so they get an epidural. Well, that epidural means that they're actually putting some type of pain blocker, some type of endorphin type of pain blocker right here. They're actually going through and they're injecting it into this epidural. So in this epidural space is where they're actually injecting that fluid. So you can see here, this epidural space, and then you can also see here, now this is actually penetrating to your meninges, and then here's your spinal cord, and then here's the spinal nerves that are extending back out. But that just kind of wanted to point out, when you see epidural, does that have anything to do with what an anesthesiologist would give a person? And yes, they're referring to the space that they're actually injecting that particular drug into. Now, here's actually kind of a cool picture too, showing your brain and spinal cord. And you can actually see that the spinal cord has different widths. So here there's a cervical enlargement, but actually back down here, when we start looking at that change from the thoracic vertebrae to the lumbar vertebrae, right here in the lumbar vertebrae, what actually is happening is this spinal cord starts breaking into smaller little fibers. And so this actually happens here at the L1 and L2. And you don't need to know the term, but the term actually that they call this, it actually refers to a horse's tail, because it kind of looks like a horse's tail is actually happening here at this break. And then these nerves get smaller and smaller, and so they even go down through your sacrum and then also through your coccyx too. So actually spinal alignment down here in the lumbar vertebrae, now misalignment of those lumbar vertebrae. This is why a lot of people have back pain. They also have shooting pain. The sciatic nerve actually branches off here too. So just kind of pay attention to that particular arrangement and why lower back pain is really, really, really common. Now, here is another picture of the spinal cord. And again, you see this butterfly shape in here. And through the spinal cord, white matter is on the outside, and then our gray matter is on the inside. And remembering that, your white matter means it's myelinated, and then your gray matter is your unmyelinated. Now, last thing in 9.12 is understanding your ascending and descending tracts. Now, these are some terms that you guys should know just in general. Is if I'm talking about ascending means to go up. And we can use that in any language, term. If I'm going up the stairs, I'm going to ascend the staircase. In ascending tracts of the nervous system, well, we're going up, and what we're referencing is we're going up to the brain. So this should make sense to you that this would be a sensory pathway. That sensory pathway that we already talked about is sending information from the peripheral nervous system towards the central nervous system. Well, it's got to go up to the brain. And so those are your ascending tracts. And then the opposite of that would be your descending tracts. And when we talk about our descending nerve tracts, now this would be your motor pathway, is what that is referencing. So we're coming down if we are descending. So with that, that ends lecture up to 9.12 on your nervous system. So I will put together another video and continue on with the parts of the brain. But I think that is plenty for now at this point. So I'm going to log us out here. And we're going to get done if I can figure this out, because, you know, I'm just learning where to go. Oh, here we go. I get to stop us now. And with that, peace. See you guys on the next one. So talk to you guys later. Bye.